In a church in Norway, 50 priests were arrested, but the very next day when investigators went to the church, they found the priests dead. Their faces were horribly burned, and their bodies were unrecognizable. Inspector Erik Lund, who had personally arrested these priests and locked them up in detention, was shaken to the core when he saw this gruesome scene. How did the priests end up dead in the church? What had happened to them after they were arrested? The most troubling part was that these were the same priests Rehan had detained just hours before. He could not understand how or why this happened. What dark force had the power to bring them back to the church only to burn them so mercilessly? Eric's mind raced with questions, but no answers seemed to emerge. These priests had been apprehended for reasons he still did not fully comprehend. What was the truth behind their arrest, and why had they died in such a horrific manner? The answers, as it would soon become clear, would reveal a chilling story of deception, power, and an unseen force that none had anticipated. This would not just be a case of simple crime, but something far darker, an investigation that would lead to shocking revelations about the church, the priests, and their deadly secrets. Inspector Erik Lund had thought his job was done when he apprehended the priests, but what he was about to uncover would make him question everything he had believed. The horrifying mystery of the priests' deaths was only the beginning of a twisted tale that would change his life forever. In the past 6 months, more than 70 or 80 complaints had been received at the police station. The parents, crying and distraught, came to the station, pleading for the rescue of their children who had gone missing. The last time their children were seen was at the famous church in Norway. Whenever the name of the church was mentioned, Inspector Erik Lund's face would tighten and his frustration would grow. He would angrily dismiss the parents, telling them that their children might have been abducted from elsewhere or perhaps met with an accident, and they were probably lying somewhere in some morgue. He insisted that if anything had happened at the church, the priests would have surely reported it. This was the same line he repeated each time. However, the parents who came with their hearts torn apart never stopped. They continued to believe that something dark was happening in that church, and their children were victims of an unknown horror. But every time they came with their pleas, Erik would brush them aside, assuring them that there was no reason to believe that anything untoward could happen in such a sacred place. According to him, the church and its priests had always been considered pillars of society, untouchable and beyond reproach. Despite the growing number of complaints, Erik continued to dismiss them. His frustration only deepened as more reports poured in. But the thing that bothered him the most was the consistency of these complaints. Each parent, each person who came in with a story about their child, spoke about the same church. It seemed that their children had all visited this place, and then they disappeared without a trace. Inspector Erik's skepticism began to wane, but he still refused to take the matter seriously. The idea that the church could be involved in any dark activities seemed too far-fetched for him to consider. He knew that something was happening, but he could not bring himself to believe that the very priests he had trusted all his life could be capable of such evil. As the number of missing children continued to rise, Erik was forced to confront the growing reality that something far more sinister was unfolding right under his nose, something that had nothing to do with coincidence. Several times, people came forward with complaints against the priests. One day, an elderly man arrived at the police station, visibly distraught. He was crying uncontrollably and shouting about the murder of his son. He accused 3 specific priests of savagely killing his child. The man claimed that his son had gone to the church for worship and was tortured and killed by the priests there. He demanded justice, pleading with Inspector Erik Lund to take action. The elderly man's cries caused a scene in the station, and many onlookers watched with sympathy, though they struggled to believe his story. Inspector Eric, feeling the pressure, listened to the man, but his skepticism remained intact. He assumed that the man's grief had driven him mad, and he considered the accusations as nothing more than the ramblings of a grief-stricken father. Eric's report on the incident would later suggest that the old man had been mentally unstable due to a chronic illness and had gone to the church, where he ultimately passed away. The report concluded that the man had mistakenly blamed the priests for his son's death, but the elderly man's story left an uncomfortable impression on Eric. Could the priests truly be capable of such violence? It seemed impossible, but the more the inspector thought about it, the more doubts crept into his mind. Yet, as per his usual response, Eric continued to dismiss the case as nothing more than a tragedy mixed with madness. The public, however, was beginning to question the priests' involvement. They were not willing to simply accept the priest's reputation as unblemished, especially when so many strange disappearances and reports had begun to surface. But then, one day, something happened that destroyed everything. A highly influential businessman, well known in the city, reported that his daughter and daughter-in-law had mysteriously gone missing after visiting the church. The businessman, desperate to find them, demanded that the priests be arrested. This was no ordinary church. It was a grand establishment, and the investigation led to the arrest of 50 priests who were serving there. Inspector Eric Lund was tasked with overseeing the arrests, and the scene was unlike anything he had witnessed before. The 50 priests, ranging in age from the very young to those in their 70s, were arrested and taken into custody. The locals watched the scene with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Many questioned how these priests, who were trusted figures in the community, could be involved in anything sinister. Why would these priests, men of faith, be guilty of such a crime? They murmured. It didn't seem possible. Eric, on the other hand, was determined to get to the bottom of the matter. The businessman's claims were serious, and the mysterious disappearances had raised too many red flags to ignore. The church, long revered for its sacred reputation, had now become the center of suspicion. Despite the accusations, there was no solid proof to directly link the priests to any crimes. The community was divided. Some believed the priests were innocent, while others started to doubt their involvement in something far darker. The local residents, however, couldn't fathom that these men could be guilty. They refused to accept that the revered church, with its long-standing history, could be involved in any criminal activity. People rallied behind the priests, hoping that they were victims of a misunderstanding or false accusations. But the truth remained elusive, and Eric knew that something was terribly wrong. As he looked at the priests, some of whom had served in the church for decades, he couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation was leading him to a place much darker than anyone could have imagined. Inspector Eric Lund decided to place the 50 priests in a special apartment, rather than a standard jail. This was a secret location used to house individuals who were influential or powerful, like the children of prominent businessmen, when they were arrested for serious crimes. The idea was to keep them away from the common criminals, and the public was led to believe they were in regular custody. Once the priests were safely locked away, Eric felt an odd sense of guilt. He stood before them, and his tone softened as he apologized. "I'm sorry you had to be detained like this, but there was pressure from above. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. You won't have to go to court. I'll handle it," he reassured them. The priests, despite their dire situation, smiled at Eric. They were calm, their faces serene, and they had no doubt in their minds that the case would be dismissed quietly. In fact, they even gave Eric a large sum of money as a bribe to ensure that the case would be closed quickly. The money was substantial enough to make anyone look the other way, and Eric, though conflicted, took the bribe. The priests were wealthy men, and they knew how to play the system. The bribe, however, left Eric with a sense of unease. He knew that he was becoming entangled in something far beyond his control. But at that moment, he convinced himself that it was the only way to protect himself and keep the situation under wraps. The priest's calm demeanor and their assurance that everything would be fine added to his growing doubt. But he pushed these thoughts aside, telling himself that he had done what was necessary. That night, Inspector Eric Lund went home and tried to sleep. But his mind was restless. The next morning his phone rang incessantly, waking him from a restless sleep. The call was urgent. He was needed at the church immediately. Eric rushed to the church, his heart pounding. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The 50 priests, the very same ones he had placed in the secret apartment, were now lying dead in the middle of the church. Their faces were horribly burned, and their bodies were unrecognizable. It was as if they had been consumed by some unearthly fire. The scene was horrifying, and the smell of charred flesh filled the air. Eric's mind raced with confusion and fear. How had they ended up here? Who had done this to them? He had kept them under strict surveillance. This was supposed to be a safe location. The fact that they were now dead in the very church where their mysterious activities had unfolded made it even more chilling. The priests had been detained and no one had known of their whereabouts. So, how did they end up here? Eric felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The investigation that he thought was under control was slipping through his fingers, and now it seemed that an unseen force was pulling the strings. The church, once a place of sanctuary, had become the center of a nightmare. The truth was still elusive, and Eric's own doubts were growing stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and powerful was at work here. The priests' deaths were not just a coincidence. They were part of something much larger, and Eric was now trapped in the middle of it. Eric stood frozen, staring at the lifeless bodies of the 50 priests. His mind was spinning, and he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He had been the one to arrest them, the one to take control of the situation. Yet, here they were, dead, burned beyond recognition. It didn't make sense. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious cause of death other than the gruesome burns. It was as if some otherworldly force had intervened. Eric immediately ordered the investigation to be intensified. He demanded that all available CCTV footage be checked, hoping to find any clues that might explain how the priests had ended up in the church and what had caused their deaths. He combed through hours of footage, but nothing unusual turned up. The footage showed nothing more than a few officers escorting the priests to the church. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign of anyone entering the church to carry out the gruesome act. Days passed, and Eric felt the pressure mounting. The case was becoming more complicated by the hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing, something right in front of him, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He returned to the church, unable to rest, unable to find peace. The mystery was gnawing at him, and it was becoming harder to ignore the nagging suspicion that something far more sinister was going on. That night, as Eric lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the strange events unfolding around him. The priests, the mysterious disappearances, the deaths. It all felt connected, but how? What was the link? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with the church. His thoughts were interrupted by a vision. He saw the church again, but this time it was different. The image of a blood-soaked cross appeared in his mind, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The next day he returned to the church, determined to uncover the truth. He made his way to the cross at the center of the church, his instincts telling him that the answers lay there. As he approached the cross, he noticed something disturbing, fresh bloodstains around the base of the cross. The blood appeared to have been carefully placed, not spilled by accident. Eric's heart raced. He knew that he was about to uncover something far darker than he had ever imagined. That night, Eric lay in bed, his thoughts consumed by the horrifying images from the church. He couldn't escape the faces of the 50 priests, their burned bodies haunting his mind. In his restless sleep, he was plagued by a nightmare. He was back in the church, standing in front of the cross. The 50 priests appeared before him, screaming in agony. They were begging for his help, calling out to him. "We gave you everything, the money, the power. Don't leave us here. You can't abandon us now," they cried. Eric woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The nightmare felt so real, so vivid. The voices echoed in his head, and the image of the cross stained with blood lingered in his mind. He could hear the priests' voices pleading for salvation, but what did it mean? Why were they haunting him? Unable to shake the feeling of dread, Eric decided to act. He gathered his team and, under the cover of night, returned to the church. He had to find the answers. He had to know what was really going on. As they entered the church, Eric felt the weight of the air shift. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. He walked slowly toward the cross, his senses heightened. There he heard something, a faint whispering, coming from the direction of the cross. His instincts screamed that the answers lay beneath it. "Take it down," Eric ordered his team, his voice trembling with urgency. As the cross was removed from its place, the floor beneath it cracked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, Eric discovered a set of old files, dusty and yellowed with age. These files contained the names and photographs of all the missing children. As the hidden compartment was revealed beneath the church's cross, Eric's hands trembled. Inside the compartment lay a collection of old, dusty files. With shaking fingers, he pulled them out and began to flip through the pages. Each file contained photographs and personal information of the missing children, children whose parents had come to him, begging for help. The names, faces, and tragic stories stared back at him. Eric's stomach turned as he realized the truth. The 50 priests, the men he had believed to be upstanding members of the community, were responsible for these disappearances. They had lured young, vulnerable boys and girls into the church under the guise of spiritual guidance, only to sacrifice them in some twisted ritual. Each file seemed to be a record of their dark deeds, carefully hidden away, kept out of the public eye. Eric felt a deep sense of horror and betrayal. He had known these men, trusted them, and yet they had been hiding this monstrous secret for years. The church, a place he had once seen as sacred and untouchable, was nothing more than a front for their sickening crimes. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The voices of the parents echoed in his mind, the pleading, the desperation, the calls for justice. He had ignored them, brushed them off as misguided, and now the truth was staring him in the face. These children's lives had been stolen, and Eric had been complicit in covering it up. His guilt weighed heavily on him. As Eric continued to flip through the seals, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Had he been part of this all along? Had the priests used his own ignorance, his unwillingness to investigate further, to continue their horrendous acts? The nightmare was far from over, and Eric knew he was no longer just an investigator. He was part of the tragedy he had been trying to solve. Eric felt as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. The files he had uncovered, the missing children, and the horrific truth about the priests, it all pointed to a single conclusion. This was a punishment from a higher power. The guilt that had consumed him, the way he had turned a blind eye to the suffering of countless innocent people, now seemed like a cosmic reckoning. The church, which had once stood as a symbol of faith and purity, was now the center of a dark conspiracy that had been hidden for years. As Eric delved deeper into the files, he found more evidence that pointed to the priests being part of a larger, far-reaching organization. They were not just acting on their own. They were part of something much bigger, something with connections that went beyond the church. This realization made the situation even more terrifying. The influence and power these men wielded could not be underestimated. The dreams, the visions of the cross stained with blood, and the messages from the priests. Eric now understood that they were not just figments of his imagination. They were warnings, warnings from a higher power, telling him that he had crossed a line, that his inaction had led to these tragic deaths. Eric had failed in his duty to protect the innocent, and now he would have to face the consequences. The messages from the priests were clear. They were not the only ones who would suffer. Eric had allowed these crimes to continue, and now the universe was demanding balance. As he knelt before the cross once more, Eric vowed to make things right. He would reopen the cases of the missing children and bring justice to those who had been wronged. He would expose the truth, no matter the cost. The nightmare was not over, but Eric knew that the only way to redeem himself was to fight for justice. The priest's death was only the beginning. Now, Eric had to find a way to confront the powerful organization behind it all and end their reign of terror once and for all. If you've made it this far, I would love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which city or place you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to bring more content your way. Stay tuned for the next part, and let's keep this conversation going. Your thoughts and opinions matter, so comment now and share this story with your friends and family. Thanks for your support.